Yo, what's good? NBA YouTube, it's your man 100 Grand Ross, but the rock never stops. And tonight, I want to get into a topic that for some of you may not feel comfortable. For some of you, it may be something that's all too familiar, but we're going to talk about it today. Head coach Tom Thibbedou of the New York Knicks is the epitome of what we refer to as white privilege. I'm going to dive into that in this video. Hit that like button for me if you enjoyed the video, if you learned something, if you agree. Subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. Let me first be clear and try to actually make sure that I give us a working definition of understanding for what white privilege is. White privilege is the both conscious and unconscious preferential treatment towards those who appear to be of European descent, meaning fairer skin, straighter hair, blonde hair, blue eye, phenotypes that are generally stereotyped to believe to come from Europe. And that in this unconscious sense, or sometimes very conscious, individuals will prefer human beings who represent European descent over other individuals. Now, you might be wondering, how does this play out in the NBA? Well, I'm so glad you asked. I'm so glad you asked. You see, how white privilege plays out in the NBA is you have individuals who are assumed the best of, who are given preferential opportunities because of how they are presumed to be deserving of them. And that presumption is one that is at the cost of those who do not have those presentations. In this situation, head coach Tom Thibbedou won the championship that he got in Boston, which he was able to basically ride even to this day. He's still considered a championship coach in many spaces. They almost forget he was an assistant. They almost forget he was one assistant amongst many assistants. And because Doc Rivers supports the guys on his staff, he gave a lot of credit to the defense, to the schemes that the Boston Celtics rolled out. Now, not to mention that head coach Tom Thibbedou was coaching one of the all-time great defenders, not just big man defenders in the NBA all-time, Kevin Garnett, who was in his prime at that time still. All-time great defenders. We see what all-time great defenders can do for any team. Any team. It's not necessarily about how good the coach is. You put Rudy Gobert on any team right now, they will be a top 10 defense. You put prime Dwight Howard on any team, as we saw, doesn't matter how many lack of good defenders there are on that team, they're going to be great. And yet, we credit Tom Thibbedou with so much of this. The defense he was able to put together in Chicago. He had Joakim Noah, Defensive Player of the Year. One of the great big man defensive players of his time, of his generation. Throughout his career, he was NBA All-Defensive Team countless times. I think he even made an All-Star game based upon how good he was on defense. He might have even been an MVP candidate based upon his skills and abilities. And yet, so much of this goes to Tom Thibbedou. Derrick Rose is on the rise for MVP level play. Before he was an MVP, we saw he was a special talent. We saw he was on the rise. We saw this was somebody who was going to dominate for a long time. And yet we give Tom Thibbedou a lot of the credit for that, as if he was developing him as a rookie. not that he inherited a player who was already on the rise. You see, this preferential treatment, we begin to assume the best about an individual. And we also tend to gloss over some of the flaws and the faults. Some of the obvious flaws and faults that have been overstated, but yet somehow does not impact his higher ability. He completely ran that roster to the ground in Chicago. It was evident. None of those guys were the same after Tom Thibbedou left. Their careers took a steep decline, their performance, and each one of them will tell you they were ran ragged. From Luol Deng, Kyle Korver, Derrick Rose even admitted it, Joakim Noah, Carlos Boozer, Taj Gibson. Each of them talked about how they were playing 40 some odd minutes and didn't know why. Blowout games. Why are we still in the game, coach? And no matter how many times people warned him and said, hey, this is going to backfire, he didn't process it. He didn't budge. He didn't change. Failed to develop rookies. His offensive schemes were simple at best, easy to game plan for, and his teams, as a result, underperformed many times. And yet, when he finally gets fired because the Chicago Bulls get fed up of it, then all of a sudden he goes to Minnesota and does the same thing. But yet he was the top coaching candidate when he got hired there, with one of the probably the more talented rosters and one of the best coaching situations that could have been available. That's what he got. That's what he got. And then you have Tom Thibbedou come to the New York Knicks. He comes in, instills his tough-mindedness, and by no means am I saying he sucks. I'm not saying he's a terrible coach. I'm saying that his privilege has allowed him to have his faults and flaws minimized and his positives overemphasized. And he's been given more chances than most, and I'll be clear about this, most black coaches and other coaches of color would ever get. Would ever get. Nate McMillan was waxing Tom Thibbedou in the playoffs, out-coaching him every step of the way. And he didn't have a secure contract until afterward. He made it to the Eastern Conference Finals. And yet the very next year, people are talking about if he should still be the head coach. You know, it's real interesting, this double standard. And yet people still defend Tom Thibbedou. People are like, hey, you know, we should give him another year. I don't know if there's a better coach out there. Shoot, I don't know if there's a better coach out there, but it doesn't minimize that he's riding off some privilege here. Privileges that don't get afforded most coaches of color at all, not even in the least bit. His inability to adjust his roster and lineups to be able to maximize this team. You know, you have Brad Stevens in Boston who's able to hide Isaiah Thomas and Kemba Walker to allow them to be effective. And yet Tom Thibbedou gets there and can't even seem to learn from scripts already written for him of how to hide a point guard who can't play defense. He fails to mix and match his roster to play maybe a young guy like a Quentin Grimes earlier on to be a 3-and-D player, which he was more than capable of coming in as a junior out of college. And decides to play Evan Fournier, and all of a sudden they have bad defense. Why didn't you play the good defenders that are sitting there on your bench waiting? And even today, despite being well out of the playoffs, they're not getting in. They're not catching up. Not even in the play-in. And yet he's still playing guys 35, 36, 37, 38 minutes, and the young guys he's supposed to be developing, that everyone's been telling him to develop, that he needs to focus on, he refuses to play. He refuses to play. Looking at the minutes here, Obi Toppin, 12 and a half minutes. Jericho Sims, 11 and a half. Deuce Miles McBride, 8 minutes and 58 seconds. The man doesn't learn. And yet we're still talking about giving him another chance, another season. Privilege must be nice. It must be nice. If only all of us could be assumed the best of and given second and third and fourth chances. But let me know what you guys think. Is this white privilege? Or are they just being nice to the guy? Let me know what you guys think. I'm going to holler at y'all later. Peace.